Just say it, man. Don't make me ask 20 questions.
What is the point?
Get to the point.
Just say it already!
Welcome to the Podcram. Let's drop into Modern Wisdom number 844, where Chris Williamson interviews Dr. Laith al-Shawath, author of Oxford's latest handbook of emotions.
Why do we have emotions?
Well, emotions are adaptive and they serve a function, even though they're often maligned and regarded as irrational. And there's a long history in psychology and philosophy of regarding emotions as these irrational forces that get us into trouble. They really each have evolved for a reason and serve a function. And so, for example, fear protects us from danger. Disgust protects us from pathogens and from contamination. Anger helps us to negotiate with people who are not treating us well enough or who are blocking our goals. Romantic love serves to bind two people to each other. Envy is a useful emotion in navigating status hierarchies, and so on and so forth. And so each emotion has an evolved function, something tied to survival or reproduction, or some other kind of goal that is tributary to survival and reproduction, like navigating status hierarchies and repairing relationships and building friendships and alliances and so on and so forth. So they all serve a function.
I've heard you say emotions are there to help us advocate for our own needs and interests. Is that an overarching summary in some form of most emotions, all emotions?
I think so, but I'd probably need to add some caveats and tweaks. First of all, some emotions seem more social than others. So, for example, guilt seems to be about repairing relationships where we've harmed somebody that we are supposed to be valuing, but we fail to value enough. Anger seems to be about demanding better treatment from those who aren't valuing us enough or not placing enough emphasis on our welfare. These are very social emotions. Disgust, on the other hand, especially pathogen disgust, is geared toward avoiding infection and avoiding contamination. So you could still think of it as like serving your interests. Your interests are avoiding infection, and fear is still serving your interests in terms of avoiding falling off a cliff or avoiding being harmed by an assailant. But some of these emotions are a bit more interpersonal than others. And there, the notion of like serving our interests acquires a more specific meaning. It often involves negotiating with others. But I want to add one other caveat, because someone recently told me that maybe they had misinterpreted this. When they heard advocating for our interests, it seemed to them like I was suggesting emotions are selfish or that they're all about looking out only for me. They're not only about looking out for me. They're about pair bonding and raising my children and protecting them and helping friends and allies and so on and so forth. But those are also our interests.
Yeah, it's like our interests in the ultimate fitness version of the sense.
Yeah.
Which includes kin, which includes the local tribe, which excludes other tribes, so on and so forth. There's almost a way that you could see the advocacy, which is kind of like the functional word in that quote of yours, disgust almost advocating for why you should behave the way that you do during disgust. Fear advocating to you about why you should. It's almost like you're negotiating with yourself.
The other point that this author makes, his name is Robert Frank, is that love helps you to solve the commitment problem. It helps you to bond with another person when, in the absence of love, it might be in your interest to always remain open to other options and to cheat on your partner and so on. But what love does, the way that this author puts it, is it brings the costs of cheating from the future into the present. So one of the classic problems is that if you were to cheat on your partner, you would obtain the benefits now and you would pay the costs later. We tend to be future discounters who pay a lot of attention to present and discount future. But if you experience love, then right now you feel guilt at the notion of cheating. Right now, you feel compelled not to because you're pair bonded and emotionally glued to your partner. So the way he puts it, and I kind of like this phrase, is it sort of brings or pulls the costs from the future into the present so that you feel the costs right now, and it alters your calculus and you're more likely to stick with your partner. We tend to think of emotions as just the way that state feels. Fear is usually thought of as feeling afraid, what it feels like to be afraid. Disgust, when you say the word disgust, people think about what it feels like to feel disgusted. But emotions are more than just the feeling state, more than just the subjective phenomenology. There are a whole host of changes in our body and brain and mind and behavior. So, for example, when you feel afraid, it is the feeling state, but it's also that your attention narrows to the dangerous stimulus and your perception is heightened. Your physiology, things like digestion and reproduction, are suppressed because they're not needed right now, and your hunger falls away, and you focus instead on escape, and energy is shunted toward the muscles for escape. And your memory is activated such that if you know the terrain, escape routes become more salient for you. And
no way. You're better at navigating when you're afraid?
Yeah, it affects even the way that you conceptually carve up the world. So I would no longer think of this mug as aesthetically pleasing or as useful for drinking. I would start to carve up everything I see as useful or not useful for escaping the dangerous situation. And so what's going on is it's changing the way you feel, the way you think, the way you remember, the way you conceptually carve up the world, and the way you behave. It's all of these things at once in service of solving this goal, which is escaping this danger. And the way that we might think of this is, I mentioned one term earlier, which is emotions as coordinating mechanisms, meaning systems that coordinate a lot of changes in the body and mind. The other term that's sometimes used is emotions as modes of operation, by which we mean that the whole body and mind go into a different mode of operation. When you're in fear mode, you're in a different mode than in disgust mode, which is a different mode than guilt or gratitude mode. And it kind of highlights again that there's a whole cascade of changes in your body and mind, and they functionally cohere towards solving this problem. So that's fear, for example. And we see similar things for other emotions too. They're essentially not just affecting how you feel, they're affecting your psychology and your physiology and your behavior all at once in an orchestrated, coordinated fashion in order to help you solve the problem at hand. So when you disgust people, for example, they don't just feel disgusted, they also actually mount an immune response involving the release of pro-inflammatory cytokines, and they have an increase in basal body temperature, which is part of the immune response. And they report feeling less extroverted and feeling less open to experience, which makes total sense because if there is a pathogen threat, this is not a good time to be like hugging and affiliating and touching people and trying new things and trying new foods. They also behaviorally avoid the source of contamination. You can actually see that in the lab. And sexual arousal becomes more difficult to achieve if you've disgusted someone. Subjects become less willing to engage in risks, especially pathogenic risks. So you're not seeing either just a feeling change or an arbitrary set of irrational changes. You're seeing a set of adaptive changes that functionally cohere and fit together and serve a function, which in the case of disgust is avoiding infection. And so I think we have this tendency in the general public and in psychology to overly identify the emotion with the feeling state, when in reality, the feeling state is one of more than a dozen things that's going on in the body and mind. And so one way of thinking about it, this is kind of the way that I and some of my colleagues talk about it, is emotions as coordinating mechanisms, which really means an emotion coordinates or regulates many different systems in your body and mind: attention, physiology, perception, behavior, memory, etc., in service of solving an adaptive problem, the problem that emotion is geared towards solving. I think another reason emotions have been regarded as maladaptive or have been given short shrift is that some of the emotions feel bad and we just don't like feeling bad. And there's this emphasis in some areas of psychology and in the general public on feeling good. I mean, we really have a cult of positivity in a lot of Western cultures. And so, fear feels bad, disgust feels bad, but they all serve a function. Fear feels bad, but it protects you from various dangers. Disgust feels aversive, but it protects you from pathogens. Shame feels bad, but it helps you to avoid status loss and reputational loss and engaging in the behaviors that would cause that status loss. Jealousy feels bad, but it protects valued mateships from abandonment or mate poaching. And so it's kind of like pain. Pain feels bad, but pain is not a problem itself. It's a signal to you that there's an external problem that's happening, like tissue damage, and that it's important for the organism to avoid that problem. So the fact that the emotion feels bad, we tend to hyper-focus on that, but the negative or aversive emotions are just as functional and adaptive and useful as the positive emotions. It's just that they evolved to help us survive and reproduce, not to make us feel good. Another insight is that, again, emotions evolved for adaptive action, but not to be maximally accurate or maximally veridical. So like a great example is anxiety. Our anxiety is hyperactive, overreactive. And this is explained by what psychiatrist Randy Nesse calls the smoke detector principle, or what some others have called error management theory. And it's basically the idea that when you build a smoke alarm, there's two kinds of errors it can make. It can either fail to detect a real fire, which would be catastrophic and deadly, or it can detect a fire when there isn't one, and it can sound the alarm when we're just cooking. And that's just a minor nuisance. So we actually build smoke alarms on purpose not to be maximally accurate. We build them to be biased toward false alarms so as to avoid the catastrophic error. And the idea is that this underlying logic doesn't just apply to humanly engineered systems like smoke alarms, it applies to animal brains. And it applies to the human brain when it comes to anxiety. Anxiety is like a sentry or vigilance system that detects threats in the environment. And so it can make one of two kinds of errors. It can fail to detect a real threat, which could be very deadly, or it could detect a threat when there isn't one there and mount the anxiety response in a defensive fashion that isn't actually needed. And so the insight is that our brains have evolved to be adaptively biased in the direction of the safer error. That's why our anxiety has so many false alarms. That's why it's so overreactive. But the cool insight is that it's not a bug, it's a feature. This is not our brains going haywire. There's nothing pathological about us. The system is actually built not to be maximally accurate, but to be maximally safe. And that design produces errors. And so this distinction between emotions evolved not to be maximally accurate, but rather to serve our survival and reproductive interests helps us to understand something like why anxiety is so hyperactive. And I think maybe that could even take some of the sting out of anxiety, because it helps people realize there's nothing wrong with you. Your brain is working normally. Everybody's like this. And the reason our brains evolved this way, there's an underlying adaptive logic to it. You know, it's not a bug, it's a feature. You're not a weirdo. We're all like this, and there's good reason for it. And so there's a number of these insights, like evolved for survival and reproduction, not for happiness, not for accuracy. Evolutionary mismatch, meaning ancestrally adaptive, not necessarily currently adaptive, that help us to understand how emotions can be both good and bad at once. And realize that emotions, like cognition, are complex information processing instantiated in the nervous system that evolved for a reason.
One implication is, well, this isn't irrational. I'm aware that it's maybe misfiring, but I even understand why the misfiring is there.
Yeah. So, I mean, maybe you're collapsing, or maybe you're holding both in mind together and you're acknowledging both, which I think is healthier than either always vilifying emotions or always the other error is always saying, oh, emotions are full of ancestral wisdom. Always trust your emotions. And that's wrong too. Like, we don't want blanket vilification, and we don't want blanket always self-help, trust your emotions. What we want is a more nuanced approach where we can go on a case-by-case basis. We can decide if the emotion is serving us or not. And if it's not, we can try to reframe, or we can try to use some of the tools that you were talking about to adjust it. You know, emotions are normally like fairly short lasting, but you can renew them if you have a thought that triggers the emotion again. Like, often when you're angry about something, the initial episode of anger will be fairly short, a few seconds, a few minutes. The reason it can go on for much longer than that is that you've re-experienced the external trigger or the internal trigger of thinking about the thing that made you angry. And so you've basically renewed the emotion. This is one of the reasons why cognitive reframing is important, because you can try to stop renewing the emotion.
What about shame?
Shame has been well studied, and so is much better understood, especially by a researcher named Daniel Sneezer. And he's done some really good work showing that shame seems to function to prevent you from engaging behaviors that would cause you status loss and reputation loss in your society, and to try also to prevent information about those things, if you have engaged in those things, from getting out, so that it, again, prevents this kind of status loss. And if you've done a bad thing and it's become known, to try to engage in behaviors to mitigate the damage. And so shame is all about reducing the likelihood of social devaluation. Because remember, in the way we evolved, closely knit hunter-gatherer communities, we were, and to some extent still are, very interdependent. We needed each other to survive. And you can't do the basic tasks of life alone, whether that's shelter or hunting or repelling invaders or repelling predators or any of that stuff. And ostracism, or being kicked out of the group, is one of the worst things that can happen to us. For many groups, especially ancestrally, that would have been a death sentence. And so falling in status or being ostracized or being devalued by one's peers is a huge adaptive problem. And so there's evidence that shame works to prevent us from engaging in those behaviors that cause that loss, prevent information about that loss from getting out. And then if it has gotten out, to appease social others, to placate them, to withdraw, to accept support, and to apologize and try to repair those wrongs for the future. All of these changes are cohering toward trying to not let us be socially devalued, try to reduce the likelihood of social devaluation.
I'm going to guess that in the same kind of bucket as these would be something like guilt and maybe regret as well.
Maybe, although there is an important distinction between shame and guilt, which is that guilt is thought of as functioning to repair a relationship with a valued other when you have hurt them or wronged them or transgressed against them or failed to place enough value on their welfare. So it's about fixing that bond that you've messed up, whereas shame is about preventing yourself from falling in the eyes of your peers.
He feels guilty. That's why he's apologizing. It's like, does he, or based on what you're saying, does he feel shame? Is shame, it's this reputational curation that somebody's now doing.
Yeah, and he might feel both, right? Because given that they're distinct, we can feel both of them. We might be feeling guilt toward the person we harmed and we're trying to fix that, and we're feeling shame that other people found out about it and we have fallen in status. So you can feel either one or the other or both, but they are solving different problems. In small group hunter-gatherer living, there was a fair shot that you were like the best at something. You were the best weaver or hunter or speaker or healer or whatever.
There just simply wasn't enough people for everybody to try their hand at weaving or hunting or speaking or whatever.
Yeah, and if your whole world was 150 people, you have a fairly good shot at being the best or close to the best at something. But now you can watch Olympians and famous actors and famous whatevers, and you know for a fact you're not the best tennis player or basketball player or skater or whatever. And so I think with the broadened exposure to the best of the best and the sort of curated facade that people portray on social media, where you compare their facade with your real life. So sadness, for example, seems to function to do a couple different things. One is to solicit aid from friends and loved ones and family, saying, I'm in need, please support me. And the other thing is to help you withdraw, conserve resources, and recalibrate because you're stuck in something that isn't working. A bad marriage, a bad job, a dead-end path. And so it's helping you to recalibrate and figure out whether your resources and your energy might be better allocated elsewhere, and you might need to quit this thing or adjust your strategy. And so even in the best of times, we'd still have sadness because it's functional, and we'd still have anxiety because it's functional. And as we said earlier, that anxiety would still be manifesting in response to things that it's not strictly needed for because of that overexpression smoke detector principle that we talked about. You know, another question that people ask is, why is happiness so difficult to achieve? Why is it so elusive? And I think there's good reasons for that too. And these insights, again, come from thinking about it evolutionarily. We have the hedonic treadmill, for example. I'm sure you're familiar with this. This is the notion that we accomplish something and then we feel happy and proud for a short period of time, but then the pride quickly dissipates, the happiness melts away, and we revert to our emotional baseline. And it sucks. And we often feel angry or frustrated with ourselves about that. Like, why can't I just remain happy or proud? But the answer is that if you think about our ancestors and you imagine some of them achieved something and then they rested on their laurels forever, versus others achieved something and they felt good for a brief period, but they soon began craving their next goal and their next accomplishment. And you ask, who would have outcompeted whom? The answer is very obvious, right? So the reason our brains are subject to the hedonic treadmill is, again, it's not a pathology, it's not a mistake. They're like that for a reason. And so that helps explain one element of why happiness is so elusive, especially like long-lasting happiness. And by the way, I think it takes some of the sting out of the hedonic treadmill. It helps me to know that this is not a pathology, that my brain is like this for a reason, that the surface apparent irrationality is undergirded by a deeper adaptive logic.
What about anger?
A lot of this work was done by someone named Aaron Sell, and he thinks of anger as a device for negotiating with others who haven't placed enough value on our welfare. Like when we feel that we're being mistreated, or we feel that a friend or a loved one or a whoever is not placing enough emphasis on our well-being, we express anger in a way to bargain with them or negotiate with them for better treatment in the future. And we're like, what anger is basically saying is, treat me better or I will impose costs on you. Or if you're already in a collaborative relationship with that person, treat me better or I will withhold benefits from you until you treat me better. And there's no doubt that anger leads to problems, lots of problems, but it also evolved for a reason. And organisms without anger would not do very well. They would not advocate in these kind of dyadic relationships for their interests. In fact, I think, there's this notion that if only we could be free of emotions, we'd be so intelligent and so rational. But organisms without emotions, creatures without emotions, would be stupider than us, not smarter. They'd be less capable of intelligent action.
How so?
If you take a rat or a mouse and you lesion the part of its brain that's involved in fear, it will no longer be afraid of the smell of cat piss, and it'll go right up to cats and it'll get eaten. And so creatures without emotions would be less capable of intelligent action in the world, not more. There are patients with brain damage to parts of their brain that are involved in emotion, like the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And these patients have trouble making even very simple decisions, like where to sit in an auditorium or where to go to dinner or what appointment to make for their next medical appointments.
I seem to remember a study being done with a guy who had this, and they asked what time did he want to come back tomorrow, and sat and observed him for 30 minutes or something while is it 3 p.m. or is it 4 p.m.?
Yeah, that's a classic example. And so the Damasio, the neuroscientist who did some of this work, asked, as you said, the patient when he wanted to come back, this date or that date. And so the patient took out his notebook and started listing all the pros and cons of each date for 30 minutes, unable to decide on which one. And eventually Damasio just said, why don't you come on the second day? And the guy was like, okay, done. And so this person was still intelligent, he was still lucid, he was still rational, but he was incapable of making the decision because sometimes emotional inputs, like a slight preference for that day over this day, is what helps us make the decision. When you look at which chair to sit in an auditorium, there often isn't a huge objective difference between the chairs, but you have a slight emotional preference for one over the other, and that helps you make the decision. And so without emotions, if we have brain damage like this patient, we find ourselves unable sometimes to make even trivial, mundane decisions.
You can explain spandrels better than me because I'm going to mess it up.
Sure. Spandrels are sometimes called byproducts. And it's the idea that, not everything in the human mind or body is an adaptation that evolved for a reason. Some things are just side effects or byproducts. And, to give a silly example, if we look at my fingers here, the negative space in between my fingers that forms a V, that V didn't evolve for any reason. It's simply a byproduct of the structure of my fingers. And there's plenty of byproducts in the human brain and body and mind. The whiteness of bones. Bones didn't evolve to be white because it helps to fend off predators or to attract mates. It's just a side effect of the calcium. The redness of blood didn't evolve because it's attractive or protects you from pathogens, just a side effect of the hemoglobin. And so a spandrel is an architectural term for, again, a byproduct of a couple of architectural features then when put together yield this. And when we're looking at human biology, psychology, and behavior, and we're asking, is this thing an evolved feature? Is it an adaptation that serves an evolved function? Or is it merely a byproduct, a side effect, a concomitant? That's where the term spandrel comes up.
You've got a new Oxford Handbook of Emotions out.
So this is a 1,400-page book. We're very happy with the way it came out. It's got almost 70 chapters in it. And if anybody's interested in emotions, it was several years in the making, and we're really pleased with how it came out.
And the cover is phenomenal as well.
Thanks for listening to this installment of The Podcram. I hope it contains something useful for you. If you enjoy these selections and are curious about the curator's own thoughts, you can check out my other podcast, Psychic Lube, where I share concise concepts meant to grease the intellectual gears and help get your creative juices flowing. Each episode is an ongoing collaborative project that welcomes listeners to expand or rebut its points by email or comment, the most interesting of which get incorporated through periodic re-recordings. As always, if you're intrigued by today's content, I encourage you to go listen to the full podcast in its original form directly from its creators so that their sponsors keep paying them to make stuff for us and nobody feels compelled to sue me for copyright infringement. Now, get off your phone and go do smart stuff. Have a productive day.